If you watched my interview with Brian Flynn from earlier this week, you might recall Brian saying that Super 7 will likely start moving away from their pre-order model and moving more toward an in-stock model where they only announce products once they've arrived and put them up for sale immediately. And this comes hot on the heels of the development with Big Bad Toy Store, where it seems that new items that cost $120 or more will require a non-refundable 10% down payment. And in that video, I said I didn't really understand which items were going to be subjected to this and which weren't, because the Series 3 of Super 7 blind boxes were not subjected to this, while other older products, older than that set, were subjected to it, only to find out that once the item was officially unveiled by Super 7, you betcha, Big Bad Toy Store slapped a 10% non-refundable deposit on it. Now, before we talk about the implications of why this move away from the model will be good and or challenging for customers, I think it's important to talk about why this model existed in the first place. For those of you who don't know, Super 7 is a relatively small toy company, and they've only gotten bigger in the past few years, but they started out much smaller. When they first started getting into 7-inch articulated action figures, they were picking up the Thundercats license from, I think it was Mattel at the time, and they were continuing that series of Thundercats figures as if the original line had continued on rather than being canceled. And as time went on, they started picking up other licenses to do in reaction, and they started thinking, hey, like, what if we started doing things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in a similar style to how we're doing Thundercats? So what they would do is they would create resin prototypes of what their ultimate TMNT figures would look like, and they would solicit them. They would see how many people are interested if we were to mass produce these. To protect themselves from investing too much into these figures, they used the pre-order model, where they would say, hey, here's an idea of what the figures would look like, subject to changes, as all pre-orders typically are. And if you're interested, you can pre-purchase now, pay the full amount up front, and you'll reserve your spot for when these figures land in approximately 8 to 12 months. And back 4 or 5 years ago, when they started doing this for the first time, it was a rather novel concept, taking the figures that you had as a kid and creating the ultimate version of them with updated articulation and all of the accessories that you would want. And by using a pre-order model, they were able to alleviate most of the risk involved with creating these figures, because if people wanted them, they could purchase up front, and then Super 7 would use the money to actually get the figures made. I believe when they first started out that the figures were closer to $45 USD, which at the time, compared to other market product that was out there, it was a relatively higher price point. So even back then, people did struggle a little bit with paying more for a figure when there's comparable product at a much lower cost. For me personally, I've always thought of Super 7 as like a guy in a garage somewhere else that would saying, hey, nobody else is making this thing, I'll make it for you, it'll just cost a little bit more money than you're used to paying. And so yeah, like if a Godzilla Ultimate is $85 when you think it should be closer to 50 or 60, well, I just attribute that to the guy in a garage tax. Like it wouldn't exist at the $50, $60 mark, but some guy over there is going to make it for me for $85. Yeah, sure, I'll do that. As their Ultimates lines got more and more successful, what we started seeing was Super 7 growing their confidence in how their lines would perform. And so rather than soliciting with resin physical prototypes, they started getting to the model now that we see with the 3D renders. And I've already put up a video talking about why 3D renders I think are totally fine most of the time, and the dangers associated with 3D models are not much more than that of a resin prototype. But anyway, this model has worked and continues to work for a variety of reasons, but I think the most paramount reason is when you're making niche characters, you don't know how many people out there are actually willing to back it, are actually willing to buy it. And so by creating a 3D render saying, here's what we think this niche deep cut character could look like if we make the figure, you can put the pre-order out there and let people vote with their wallets. Do I want a Gabara Ultimate? Do I want a Titanosaurus Ultimate? And sometimes the answer was no. In recent years, we've seen that multiple waves or different characters within a wave are getting canceled, and it's just that the customer demand isn't really there. In chatting with Brian, it seems that all companies have really moved toward this pre-order model where we'll show you what the thing looks like. It's not going to land for, 6 months, but you can buy it now. And Brian's sense is that the customer in general is starting to be fatigued by the overwhelming number of pre-orders out there. I myself definitely feel this. I'm tired of something being announced and then not getting into my hands for at least 9 months. I saw Godzilla -1 December 1st, 2023, and it seems as though the earliest I'll get my hand on an Ultimate figure from Super 7 is early September. So, 9 months, maybe 10 months, depending on how long it takes to get to Canada. Hot off the heels of Godzilla X Kong The New Empire, Hiya Toys just showed off their Shimo figure, and Shimo Q4 2024, which means it could be 6 months away, it could be 9 months away. If you play a lot of video games, you're probably used to things like this. Like, was Elder Scrolls 6, 7? I don't even know anymore. It was announced like 6 years ago, something like that, and it's still not even out. We haven't seen anything for it. I'm a big fan of the Nintendo method, where you say, hey, we're announcing this game for the first time and it'll be available in 3 months from now. Like that feels really good to me as a consumer. It's like, you show it to me, great, you get me excited, and it's only 3 months away. That's amazing. I was so excited to see Hiya Toys unveil their first Godzilla X Kong figure, even though it was a redeco of a figure I already own. But it was like, hey, here's a figure that we're doing for the new movie, and it will start shipping in 2 weeks. Like, what? That's unheard of in this hobby and given year. And this might speak to why Super 7 is moving toward this model. Instead of committing to a purchase that you're not going to see for the better half of a year, let's bring it in-house, bring it in stock, and put it up and see how people feel about it. And hopefully you strike while the iron is hot. You sell the product as it's availed for the first time. You capitalize on that excitement. You get it into people's hands relatively quickly, and people seem excited, and they're wanting to buy more. With an example specific to Super 7 that Brian talked about, that Super Cyborg Mechagodzilla. I remember when they announced that earlier in 2023, and while it was selling out in places like Entertainment Earth, Big Bad Toy Store, where you had that zero down option, it was on the Super 7 website. I expected it to sell through relatively quickly because all of Super 7 Super Cyborgs sell through really quickly, but it stayed in stock. Nothing really happened with it. But then when Super 7 made their post announcing it was in stock, I watched it fall out of stock. I saw it hit low stock. It got restocked a few times. It went off like gangbusters. So for me personally, yeah, I'm really getting tired of the zero down pre-orders. I would rather put up the money and get the product sooner, unless it's a company that I know I can get behind. So for an example, I've pre-ordered the Godzilla Evolved and the Shimo from KaijuCanuck Toys. I use my friend Harold's coupon down in the description. They get their figures the same day that Hiya releases them in China, so you get them relatively quickly. You should use Harold's code, and you should go check out Harold's channel if you aren't already subscribed. But I can trust Hiya. I have enough of their products that I know what I'm getting into, and I have no problem putting the money up front, especially because KaijuCanuck ships items in the order that they received the purchases from customers. So I want my Shimo as soon as possible. So moving away from pre-orders to an in-stock model, it's good for customers in the sense that you're not subjected to long wait times anymore. You get the item relatively quickly. But it's good for the business because they capitalize on the excitement of the announcement right away, rather than having this lag time of at least 8 months. And let's face it, in a hobby where everyone is starting to move towards pre-orders, there's definitely an advantage to having product come into stock and saying, hey, our thing is available now. You don't have to buy it 8 months from now. You don't have to wait for it. Our thing is available now. So that's what's good about it. Now let's talk about what concerns me as they move away from this model. With a pre-order model, you solve the issue of supply and demand by making them made to order so that whoever wants one can get one. When too few units of a figure is made, then the people who want to buy it at MSRP are unhappy because they're all bought up and they're being sold on the aftermarket for over-bloated prices. When too many of a figure are made and a bunch of them go to clearance, then the people who paid MSRP for them are upset because other people are getting them at a reduced price. If you're moving toward an in-stock model where you're not relying on customers to tell you how many you need to make, how do you properly gauge how many of an item you're going to make? Unfortunately, you have to look at past trends and market research to see what sells and what doesn't. And if you look at that market research, the standout is Godzilla, right? It's always going to be Godzilla. He is the star of his own series, of his own legacy. So you're going to get your Bio Goji, you're going to get your Burning Goji, you might get your Godzilla 54, you'll get your Godzilla -1. Those are pretty much in the bag. You might also get characters like Mechagodzilla. He's a robot version of the titular character, and so pretty easy sell. Characters like Space Godzilla or Destoroyah. We now have, Monster Arts releasing multiple versions of these characters. Super 7 themselves have done these characters in highly articulated action figure format, so that market research now exists for companies like Hiya to take a look at and say, maybe we should do those too if people are buying them and they're happy with them. But when it comes to characters like Titanosaurus, like King Caesar, they haven't been done in a 6 or 7 inch highly articulated format. The market research doesn't exist. How do you expect Super 7 to make a calculated risk if the numbers aren't there to determine whether or not the figure will be successful? I would expect that this will result in one of two things, maybe even both. You will see a ton of repaints of the popular characters. We're talking Godzilla, we're talking Mechagodzilla. You're going to see a whole bunch of those. You're going to see repaints of molds that people were happy with, so you might get a battle damage Destoroyah. You might even get like a glow-in-the-dark Destoroyah. I think that would be pretty cool. Or you're going to see those niche unmade characters in either limited quantity or at a higher price point. We already see the higher price point with SH Monster Arts. When they're making their Monster X, they're making their Showa Gigan, those figures are way more expensive than the Godzillas are, because if you're convinced that not as many people want them, fewer units are made, and that means that there are fewer units to absorb some of those fixed manufacturing costs that I've talked about before. We might see Super 7 go down the Hiya route, where you see a mold reused 4 or 5 times, only then getting a new mold of a niche character that may or may not have been made before, just so that the risk is mitigated because you've made your money on those other repaints. In the first 4 waves of Toho Ultimates from Super 7, we had 7 unique molds. And as we transition toward a more in-stock model, I'm just worried that the ratio of recolors to existing molds is only going to get higher. We're going to see more recolors of popular characters because they're a financially safe bet. That doesn't mean that new characters are completely off the table and we're not going to see any of them. It just means that they're going to be slower to come out in a line that's already doing 2 figures per wave, and we haven't seen a wave since July of 2023. That being said, if this new in-stock model proves to be successful and we see that people are more likely to engage with a line when these things are readily available as soon as they're announced, who knows? We might see newer molds come up more frequently if these figures are selling out and if they're doing well. And that's also not to disparage the potential of repaints. I mentioned a couple during my interview with Brian. I think that there are definitely repaints out there that I would be really interested in getting, as long as there are also new characters thrown in there. That's going to be it from me, but I'm curious to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the current pre-order bonanza going on across the collecting hobby? Are you getting tired of it? Do you prefer it over in stock? Would you be more likely to engage with the toy line if things were readily available as they were announced? Let me know in the comment section down below. I'd like to thank all of the Category 3 channel members for their continued support, as well as everyone that watches, likes, and comments on my videos. Your support is immensely appreciated. Twitter and Discord links are in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.